Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at Intersections. I'm Connie Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, and we are the host of the monthly Intersections Luncheon. And so we're very glad to have you here, and we're also very thankful for St. Paul's. Is this on, Jonathan? Okay. All right. Sounded like it went down or something, but we're very thankful for St. Paul's and their willingness to host us here, at least for the time being. We've always been at First Presbyterian Church, and as you likely know, they have had some renovations, and so St. Paul's has been an amazing host last month and this month, and we're grateful for that hospitality. Intersections at its very core is really about civil dialogue and making sure that we can have conversations in a civil manner, but oftentimes difficult conversations. And today's subject can be, depending on who is talking with each other. So we are delighted to have our national president and CEO of Interfaith Alliance with us today. I will tell you that the format for Intersections is our speaker will talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open up to Q&A. At that point, I'll bring the microphone around to those who want to ask questions. So we'll get to that in a moment. But I wanted to introduce to you Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush as President and CEO of Interfaith Alliance, an ordained Baptist minister. Reverend Raushenbush is a longtime leader of the Interfaith Alliance movement, working to protect an inclusive vision of religious freedom for people of all faiths and none. Today, we're going to talk about Christian nationalism, the rise of Christian nationalism, the history of Christian nationalism, and its impact, particularly on marginalized communities, but also our democracy in general. Reverend Raushenbush is the great-grandson of the first Jewish Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis, and the great-grandson of Baptist theologian Walter Raushenbush, a key figure in the social gospel movement. Paul's commitment to interfaith advocacy comes in part from his own interfaith background. Prior to coming to Interfaith Alliance, Paul served as Senior Vice President of the Auburn Seminary, the founding and executive editor of HuffPost Religion, Associate Dean of Religious Life and Chapel at Princeton University, and a founding editor of BeliefNet.com. Most recently, he was the Senior Advisor for Public Affairs and Innovation at Interfaith America. Paul has spoken about religious diversity and the importance of inclusive religious liberty at colleges, churches, institutes, and with many media outlets at the national level. He also has published 2 books and contributed essays to several volumes on faith and public life. And I would say also, this is not part of his bio, but additionally, Reverend Paul Raushenbush, I would say, has become one of the leading voices talking about religious Christian nationalism, and calling it out and making sure that Americans really understand its impact in our nation today. So will you help me welcome Reverend Paul Raushenbush?
Well, let me say, how do I sound? Can people hear me in the back? I'm loud anyway, and it's nice to be amplified. So let me say, first of all, to Connie, thank you so much to Connie for all of the work of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa. We brag about Iowa all the time because Iowa is one of our greatest affiliates. We have affiliates around the country. We most recently in places that really don't need us at all, like Texas and Florida. But we lift up the example of what can happen through the great organizing and great just relationship building of Interfaith Alliance Iowa. I want to thank Jonathan for and his incredible team for hosting this meeting. And mostly I want to thank all of you. I mean, isn't it nice to have the problem of not enough chairs? I mean, this is what, this is great. So I'm honored to be here. Not in my bio is that I'm from Wisconsin. So this feels very comfortable for me here and a little bit of a homecoming, even though my current residence is in New York City. And so I'm delighted to be here. And I want to start with a little bit of personal history. You heard a little bit about my background, but my great-great-grandparents came to this country from the uprisings of 1848, which were known as the People's Spring in Europe. And this side of my family were in Vienna and in Prague, and they were the Jewish part of my family. And what they experienced in Europe was a kind of marginalization, constant being surveilled, constantly being specifically taxed, constantly being relegated to second-class status. My great-great-grandfather, sorry, Joseph Goldmark was one of the leading kind of people who fought back against the monarchy in Vienna. They established the first Reichstag in Vienna. This is an amazing history that I was so ignorant of. It's like I went through college and everything and didn't know about this history. But they created a Reichstag in 1849 in Vienna, and they began to legislate. And they legislated for freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of all of this. And he was one of the leading voices in that until the monarchy reestablished power, and he had to flee to America, along with the Dembitz family, the Dembitz family, the Whaley family, and the Brandeis family. And what they found there was just incredible to them. They encountered a freedom of religion in America that was unimaginable in Europe. And you may be asking how the descendant of all these Jews became a reverend, and we can talk about that maybe in Q&A. But the important thing is that this freedom that my ancestors experienced was not an accident. The founders of America were thoughtful and intentional about the role that religion would play in the country, and they inscribed that intention in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It would be impossible to be clearer. So for anyone today suggesting that America was founded as a Christian nation, they are arguing against the First Amendment. And that's really important for us to remember when we have this conversation about Christian nationalism and the idea of this being a Christian nation. The First Amendment is very clear about it. So they're not only arguing about the Constitution, they're arguing about a lot of other things that surrounded the Constitution. My Jewish ancestors arrived about 5 decades after George Washington wrote his letter to the Hebrew congregation. And he wrote to them, assuring them of their equal status. He said, all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that tolerance is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. That is amazing. No one is tolerated in America. Everyone is deserving of equal rights. And if we needed more proof that the founders did not intend the United States to be understood as a Christian nation, the Treaty of Tripoli makes it explicit. How many people know the Treaty of Tripoli? A smattering. Not even really a smattering, a drip, I would say. But this is really good stuff to know, because this is contested ideas. The Treaty of Tripoli was written by George Washington in 1796 to avoid war with Muslim nations over trade. And the treaty was signed by John Adams and ratified unanimously by the Senate at the time. That was half filled with signers of the Constitution. And the treaty says, and I quote, "As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, it has no enmity against the laws or religious tranquility of Muslims." So these are important documents for us to talk about, because they give us a solid ground upon which we can talk about what was intended in this country, which was religious diversity and the ability for religion to thrive because there was no established religion. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of America, reinforced the First Amendment and coined the phrase separation of church and state in his letter to the Danbury Baptists. But he also showed his comfort with religious diversity by saying, it does me no injury for my neighbor to believe in 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So I mention these examples because if someone mentions to you that we are a Christian nation from our inception, they are factually incorrect, and more so, they are intentionally misleading, rewriting history, and imposing a religious hierarchy onto a country that was intentionally founded to do just the opposite. So I may quote myself a little bit on this in this presentation because I have not myself, but people who I have interviewed on my podcast. If you're a podcast listener, I want to invite you to sign up for the State of Belief, because I do actually interview everyone who's doing good work on Christian nationalism, anti-Semitism, and things like that. So please do sign up. One of the people who was on my show is Princeton historian Kevin Cruz, who's a wonderful scholar. And he said, despite the founders' intent, later generations of Americans began to assert that the country they created was indeed Christian. So claims of being a Christian nation, we also have to acknowledge, come with an implicit white supremacy that really translates into being founded as a white Protestant nation. My family experienced freedom in their new country in part because in the mid-1900s, Jews of Northern Europe, the right kind of Jews, were granted temporary status as white. However, the reality they confronted was that a large portion of the population that was not white was also not free and not considered American. The brutal institution of slavery had been part of the same country that espoused the values of freedom since the beginning. And just a few years after my ancestors arrived, the Supreme Court decided in the odious Dred Scott decision that upheld slavery and further ruled that because Mr. Scott was of African descent, he could not be a citizen and therefore had no right to sue. This toxic mix of racism and religious bigotry was apparent in the 1920s, when the Ku Klux Klan marched 50,000 strong down the streets of Washington, D.C., and they were rallying completely against the rights of Black Americans, Jews, Catholics, and explicitly threatening violence against them. In the 1920s, laws were passed to restrict immigration through a quota system that promoted immigration from Western and Northern European countries to keep out the perceived dangerous influence of Catholics and Jews from Eastern and Southern Europe. These laws were also used to restrict Muslim and Hindu populations from the Middle East and South Asian that had been growing in the country. The aim was to restrict non-white races as well as non-Christian religions. Also in the 1920s, the so-called prerequisite cases decided by the Supreme Court denied citizenship rights to Japanese petitioners and to South Asian petitioners on the grounds that they were not white. A few decades later, in response to the perceived threat of communism, the phrases "one nation under God" and "in God we trust" were introduced into the common language of America. That's in the 1950s. In 1949 and again in 1954, the National Association of Evangelical proposed a constitutional amendment to put God and Jesus in the nation's constitution. And it is worth noting that they were defeated by a coalition of Christian and Jewish groups who said that was a terrible idea. The effort to put God and Jesus in the Constitution only further underscores that they're not there to begin with. Intentionally left out by the founders who understood exactly what they're doing. So here's another point. And I'm a pastor, reminding you, religion is too often used for terrible, terrible ends. A powerful strain of religion was instrumental in the undergirding of slavery. Religion professor Harry Stout of Yale wrote, "White Christians in the South didn't just support slavery, the Southern Church was the backbone of the Confederacy and its attempt to keep African Americans in bondage. Southern clergy had no doubt that slavery was not a sin. The support of white supremacy, oppression of Black Americans continued after emancipation through Jim Crow, the battle for civil rights, and continues today. Religion claims from the 1600s were used in the doctrine of discovery and to legitimate the abrogation of rights and taking of land from indigenous people for the past 4 centuries. And that was renounced, this is 1600s, renounced this year by Pope Francis. So these examples remind us that freedom of religion is a cornerstone of the idea of American democracy. But we also always have to be asking the question, whose freedom, whose religion? Let's ask the next question and make sure that we really are thinking about the entire population. The language of the First Amendment makes clear that the freedom to believe as we choose is unalienable, but it is not unlimited. This freedom of conscience to believe what we want exists side by side with civil rights that ensure that every one of us can engage in our democracy with equal dignity. How we engage with one another is perhaps summed up in the legal truism, your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. The tension between this religion democracy has been present since the inception of our nation. It has not gone away. And in our time, Christian nationalism is attacking the principles of religious freedom that America was founded upon and represents an existential threat to our democracy. Christian nationalists revel in denying history and proclaiming our country a Christian nation that they conveniently make in their own image. They are determined to impose the imprimatur of their narrow faith tradition upon the laws of the land, using the power of courts and government, and perhaps most dangerously of all, they use the rhetoric of Christian nation with its underpinning of white supremacy, xenophobia, patriarchy, and authoritarianism to dictate who is a true American and who will be relegated to the perennial outside status to be tolerated in just such a manner that George Washington declared should never happen. The goal of Christian nationalism is the establishment of a theocracy. As Catherine Stewart explained on my podcast, State of Belief, Christian nationalism is an ideology. It is a political movement and a quest for power. Unfortunately, Christian nationalism is not relegated to a shadowed corners of our country. A poll released by PRI, Public Religion Research Institute, and Brookings indicates that close to 30% of American population is either adherents or sympathetic to Christian nationalism. And among white evangelical Protestant, that number jumps to nearly 2/3. 1 in 4 American believes that the United States should declare itself a Christian nation. We know that Christian nationalists hold a remarkably higher negative attitudes towards the right of Black Americans, immigrants, Jews, Muslims, LGBTQ people, and the role of women than in the wider population. So there's lots of information about this. That's a great report by PRI on white Christian nationalism, definitely worth finding out. But one of the statistics that if you think about the legacy that we're talking about of white supremacy and Christianity and our country, 80% of Christian nationalists disagree with the statement that generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Black Americans to work their way out of the lower class. So if you think about that statistic, that is just one of many statistics, it's very clear why Christian nationalists are behind the efforts to ban African American studies, banning books, the increased anti-Semitism in our country, the increased Islamophobia and hate overall. All of it is deeply grounded in a worldview of the Christian nation that they determine and they want our country to look, and they are determined to get their way. As Catherine Stewart wrote in the New Republic, Christian nationalists are increasingly framing their efforts as a spiritual battle that resonates with many of its followers. So what they do, they pit the power of Jesus, which is their side, against the power of Satan, which may be many of you, in their view. And this is not only being preached in churches, but elected officials are saying it. Governor Stitz of Oklahoma prayed after his reelection, "Father, we claim Oklahoma for you. Every square inch of it, we claim it for you in the name of Jesus." Which, what do you do if you're not a Christian in Oklahoma? It's unbelievable. And the governor of Ron DeSantis, who probably is like, in these woods these days, he's trying to make a name for himself, that young fella. In his campaign in Florida, he said, "Put on the armor of God, stand firm against the left's schemes." This is from Ephesians. That's not how Ephesians reads. It says the devil's schemes. So what they're doing is using spiritual warfare to talk about their worldview and imposing that on us. And unfortunately, what happens when politicians use this rhetoric, they're openly calling their opponents agents of evil, and it puts politics into the zero-sum game of spiritual warfare. Last bit of bad news, and then we're going to turn around. But one of the things that was in the PRI's findings was that Christian nationalists are 7 times more likely than the rest of the population to believe that violence is legitimized. They responded to this: because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save our country. They agree with that at 7 times the rate of the rest of the population. And we saw that on January 6th, and we see that in other ways around the country. Our most recent affiliate is in Southwest Florida, and they were seeing Christian nationalism happen in their own neighborhood. They got organized. They showed up to the school board meeting and spoke and said, "We want a school that is safe for all kids," etc. One of the people who spoke was a rabbi who was connected. He got harassed and intimidated after the event, and good news is that 200 people joined Interfaith Alliance Florida after that. Bad news is that this is terrorism. Another example is one of our Interfaith Alliances in Central California that had an LGBT fundraiser in their church. And a week later, they had all their sanctuary windows broken, and the Proud Boys left their card. Again, this is terrorism, trying to inflict an idea. Proud Boys, who are claiming the mantle of Christian nationalism, although you can't imagine how little they have in common with Christianity. So that's all like true and bad news, and yet there's lots of good news. Is that this is immensely unpopular. These ideas are actually very much at odds with the majority of Americans still. 70% of Americans reject the call to declare America a Christian nation. Close to 75% of Americans said they prefer a country made up of diverse faiths and not just Christianity. 80% of Americans reject the idea that Christians should exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Christian nationalists are out of step on issues of race, of gender, of LGBT issues, and the demographic trends are also very much against this movement. They, to put it bluntly, they look a lot like me, older white Protestant. All of these demographics, and I guess I'm looking at a bunch of kindred. These demographics are not the ascendant demographics in America, and so we have the opportunity as America grows more diverse in every way, including religiously, as well as those who have no religion, to harness that energy to counteract Christian nationalism. What is animating the Christian nationalist movement is the most powerful and worst motivate. It's fear. Trump tapped into this fear with his backwards-facing motto, and just this year, he said to his followers at CPAC, "This is the final battle. If we don't do this, our country will be lost forever." So they have made their goals clear. They are attempting to hold on to power, and they are willing to use force to achieve it. And so it's up to all of us, every one of us in this room, to make sure they are not successful. And I am going to say today to you, we are going to win. We are going to win. 1,000%. I asked a black leader who does a lot of justice work, civil rights work. His name is Eric Ward, and he said the biggest lie they want us to believe is that we're losing. He said, never in the history of America have more people said that they want to live in a multiracial country. Never in the history of America. We are winning. Oh my God, he said that on my podcast, The State of Belief. Another person who said that on my podcast, I said like, this was an incredible woman named Rabbi Sandra Lawson, who is a convert to Judaism, black, lesbian. And I said, gosh, it must be so hard. What gives you hope in the face of being in such intersecting? And she said, Paul, we've already won. I've seen what's happened in my country over the time. My grandparents had nothing like what we have today. So the important thing is to remember here is that we are going to win. But to win, we have to stand together, and we have to declare victory, and we have to let people know that we are on the side of America, we are on the side of faith, and we're going to stand up and say, this is what we represent. We are patriots, we are faithful people, or people who believe in religious diversity, and we're not going to let you take those mantles for yourself. So we are going to cast this beautiful vision that people want, a vision of religious freedom, and demand that all of our moral and ethical mandates, which in this country now, 70% of religious people support marriage equality and full lack of discrimination for LGBTQ people. And yet to hear it, you think that that's the anti-religious position. That's the religious position. We have to claim the religious position. That people want, we want racial equity. We want schools where people are not coerced to pray according to some random football coach who demands his right to pray. It's like, you can pray all you want, and yet you're trying to coerce these kids. Whose religion? Whose freedom? We have to claim religion, and we have to claim freedom, and we have to claim America for ourselves. And just to remind them that their right to swing their fist does not ends where our faith and our nose begins, our lives. And so we are going to claim the mantle of religion. We've been doing that in Interfaith Alliance for we're going to be celebrating our 30 years, 28 years, Interfaith Alliance, Iowa. One example, and let's see, how are we doing? Oh, I should wrap up pretty soon, right? Okay. We've just been doing so much good work, is what I want to say. We've been doing so much good work, and I'll mention religion. The marriage bill, Respect for Marriage bill in Washington. We gathered all the religious groups, except for a couple, to say we support marriage equality. And when they tried to shut it down because it was anti-religious, Dick Durbin held up our letter and said, "No, I have all the religion right here. You can't claim the religious mantle. We're not going to let you get away with that anymore." And so this is where we're at. Let me see. And I want to just, before I end, I will say, in Florida, after that harassment, Interfaith Alliance Florida, like, ballooned up. People were like, no, we're not going to let that happen in our community. We're going to show up. We're going to with one another. And we're not going to let people terrorize us into becoming, letting Christian nationalists win. In Fresno, where that church got its windows broken in, the whole community, indigenous people, Muslims, Jews, Catholics, everyone showed up to that church and said, not on our watch, we're here with you. Mayor, come here. We want to show you what's going on. You have to support our rights. And so I will end, but one of the trainings we did in Interfaith Alliance of Texas was in Dallas. And at the end of it, someone said, I just feel less alone. And that's what we're reminded. Interfaith Alliance is an alliance, bringing people together to feel less alone, to feel more powerful, to be in this moment in America. And I'm going to end by going back to my great-great-great-grandfather, Joseph Goldmark, who stood up on the floor of the Reichstag, prepared to argue for the rights of Jews. But before he could do it, his best friend, the Catholic priest, Father Fuster, stood up and he said, if we free the Jews, we free ourselves from the sway of Christian barbarism, of tyrannical Christian bigotry. That was the Catholic priest saying that in support of his Jewish friend. And that is the liberation that we want, the inspiration of Gandhi, of Heschel, of King, all coming together. And I'll say this, and this is really the last thing. As mentioned, my great-grandfather out of Europe, who found that freedom, and he said the most important political office is that of the private citizen. And so, fellow humans, this is our time to rise up, to find union with one another, to join one another in common cause, to make sure that out of many we celebrate the truly being one. Thank you very much for this time.
Thank you, Paul. It is our habit that I bring the microphone to you. So catch my eye. If I'm at one place, I can travel across the room, I promise, and get all my steps in. So just catch my eye, raise your hand, and I will come to you.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here today in your presence. Help me with the name of your podcast.
Of my what?
Your podcast.
and I did pay him $20 to say that. So yes, you will get your 20. It's The State of Belief. And if you go on Apple Podcasts or anywhere, you can find it. The State of Belief. And again, like I've interviewed all of the wonderful people doing great work across the country, as well as people like Jamie Raskin, Bishop Barber, a lot of really just fabulous people. I have a big Rolodex from my time over the years, and so and I've interviewed Connie and local heroes from across the country. And yes, I will give you your 20. See me right after. Yes.
Hi, thank you. I am curious. I'm hopeful by what you're saying that 70% of the nation is against this. But when you hear the news, you look at the polls, you look at who's leading in the presidential polls, it's discouraging. It feels like we're losing, and it feels like we are using the Bible as a weapon, or we're getting the Bible used against us as Christians, against other Christians, and I feel alone, and I don't. What do you do? And how are you inspirational when we see the government going absolutely against with banning books, taking rights away, and it's hard.
I really appreciate that question. It is hard. It can be very discouraging. And one of the reasons I include these statistics is to make people feel like, to recognize that what they're feeling, and in Iowa, I can imagine you're feeling a specific way, because you're in a kind of a bad moment in Iowa. But I grew up at a time when Iowa was actually in a different place. And we lifted up Iowa as one of the best places in the country because it had the highest literacy rate and And so nothing is permanent. People can change. And the most important thing that I can offer is when we got through other important, difficult moments in our country's history, it wasn't because it felt great. Like it was hard. But the enemy of any progress is alienation and isolation. And this room, and we were in a room, I don't know how many people are here, but lots. And yesterday we were in a room with 250 people. These are not, it's not 50,000, but this is a powerful room. And I just encourage you to surround yourself with people who are powerful, who are willing to show up and to speak up. Because, even if it's hard for you and if you feel alone, you actually, by saying a good word, can save someone's life. Like, I really believe that on a lot of issues, if people if they hear, like, especially someone religious saying something positive about a trans person or something like that, that's life-saving. We have the power to be great agents of change. And so we are on, the majority is with us. Young people also, like, have very little tolerance for what is being put forward by the Christian nationalist movement. And so, like, so that's part of the reason they want to restrict, some people are like saying, maybe they shouldn't vote until they're 25. I mean, like, we see this, so let's make sure that we're talking to people, that we're inviting people, and that we're also, like, one of the things we're going to be doing, frankly, before the election is really talking about Christian nationalism and where we see it and say, this is what you're saying. The policy, do you realize the policy you're saying prohibits religious freedom? So my thing right now is with banned books. That's a religious freedom issue, because 57 of the banned books have been about, 47 about Jewish experience, 57 about Muslim experience. And if we start taking the narrative, sorry, I know, I'm moving, I should come back here, sorry. She said, are you a wanderer? I said, no, I'm not a wanderer. Of course, here I am. But let's make sure that we are speaking loudly, taking the narrative, and being with one another, finding ways to be with one another so that we don't despair. That's really, really important. Yo.
Hi, you actually partially answered my question, but what concrete steps can I take to join this fight?
Well, I really appreciate that question. I think, I will use it as an opportunity. I think mostly listening to my podcast. No, I'm just joking. Interfaith Alliance of Iowa is doing great work about helping people have the language and the ability to show up when it matters. But there's lots of ways to do this. Congregations, by the way, can be a major spot. I'm looking at you, Jonathan. Can be a major location where people can actually talk about this, where people can share information, where people can have rapid response, where people can also, frankly, learn the spiritual discipline that it will take to respond to some of what we're seeing. And so I would just encourage you right now to educate yourself about what Christian nationalism looks like, prepare yourself for conversations. And if anyone in this room feels called to it, feels like they have this as if you're good at dialogue, try to reach out. Because a lot of people think that the way they have to exercise their faith is in this route of Christian nationalism. They think being a good Christian means. And if we can offer people another way to understand what being a good Christian in 21st century America might mean, I think that, dialoguing with people, I sometimes preach about this, and I say, like, my first instinct is a fist, but then I move to the open hand, because I do think people can change their mind, that can come out of it and be invited. So I encourage us to think about the conservative Christians who think that Christian nationalism is the path. But if you really start talking to them about what it might mean, invite them out of it and figure out ways. But education, connections, and mobilization when it counts, showing up. I think people would be very surprised to see this many people showing up in front of a school that has decided to mandate school prayer and asking the question, who's leading this prayer? Whose freedom? Whose religion? One of the things we did in Texas instituted passed a law saying that different school districts can fire school counselors and hire untrained chaplains in their stead. Christian chaplains who have no training in this. And what we did is we got out in front of it, and we got 170 chaplains from across Texas to sign on to a letter saying, this is spiritual malfeasance. This is terrible for religion. And so the headlines that ran across Texas was, religious groups oppose chaplain bill. That's the headline you want. So it's being really smart about narrative. It's getting out in front of it. And then a school board said, we voted against this because the religious community asked us to vote against it. You see how that's an example of something that took some strategy and collaboration, but it's a way that we can win. Showing up, defining the narrative, and owning the Americanness and the religiousness of our cause.
You mentioned your podcast, and you mentioned just being in Texas. I just listened to The Grapevine, a new NBC podcast, which is about what's going on in the North Texas schools, where school board members that are espousing an evangelical philosophy called the Seven Nations are taken over. And which seems, we have Moms for Liberty here, Brushfire, who seem to be aligned with our governor and our congresswoman. But can you put some perspective on that nationally? I mean, like where that is?
Book banning and
well, I mean, like what we're seeing apparently in these schools in North Dallas, where the school board members have been taken over by these groups. I mean, is this isolated, or is this something that you're seeing?
No, that's the thing. It's not isolated. It's completely a national campaign. And they have a national project. And they're like using it in all across the country. And they are well financed. And they have a strategy to show up, and what my big thing is is that we need to actually be even better than they are. We need to be smarter. We need to be out there, because the vast majority of people don't want censorship of books in school. But they are using, and they do trainings about it, how to show up to a school board, how to effectively take over a school board. That's what they're doing trainings on. And so this is a national problem, and it requires a national solution. But every single national, we are a national organization, and we only are effective because we have local people like Connie's crew, Connie and this broad group that can show up in local fights. And so I just encourage people to recognize that it's the same with the anti-trans bills that have 50. You don't have 50 bills across the country happen like this. It's because the language was written for them. They introduced it, and that's what we're seeing across. And so we have to be just as smart. I talk about power a lot, and that makes some progressives feel uncomfortable. I'm not talking about amassing power in a central location. I'm talking about power for the people to make sure that they have the power to withstand the attacks on democracy that are happening. And I encourage this room to think about, like, how can we build power in Cedar Rapids and in Iowa more broadly?
Throughout the founding documents, many, many times a reference to the Bible. Do you acknowledge that?
What's that?
Throughout the founding documents, throughout the writings of the founders, they acknowledge references to the Bible when they got in sticky
wickets. There's no reference to the Bible. There's a reference to, like, the providence.
Sir, you are lying.
So it is not the.
It's a fact. It's a fact. It's a fact.
It is. It is not a biblical document. It is. There may have been parlance that was there. There is like an idea of a higher power that's sometimes introduced, but it is not a biblical document, and it should not be understood that way. That was not the intention. I'm sorry. It doesn't mean that people can't. The whole idea was that people could exercise their Christianity freely without the imposition of a state religion, specifically the Church of England or some other religion. That was absolutely, and you can understand how important that was to the people who founded this country.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Is that coming? Okay. I wonder if you think it might be useful to understand the rise of Christian nationalism for people to read Jesus and John Wayne by Christian Nationalism.
Yeah. That's a great book.
It's
really, really important book. Jesus and John Wayne. I forget the lady. It was a wonderful woman who wrote it.
Kristen Dumas.
Yeah, it's just one of the a very important book about how this is the evolution of it. Very helpful.
This isn't a question, it's just an observation. In the U.S. Constitution, 1787, there's not a mention of God. The only direct reference to religion is Article 6, there should be no religious test for a public office. Then 2 years later, they amended the Constitution, and the First Amendment talks about Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So that's the only references to religion in the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence has some allusions by Jefferson to the supreme judge for the rectitude of our intentions, but it's kind of deist references, but there are no biblical references in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. So,
I think it's also,
I'm a historian from Kirkwood Community College. So.
That's very helpful, thank you. And I do think it's very interesting that one of the only references to God was there should be no test. That's powerful stuff. And again, I just invite you to think about, this actually was meant to let religion thrive. That was the goal. It was to let religion thrive in all of its manifestations. And this is why we have a much more religious country than, say, Europe, which had a state religion. It's just super important. I mean, the historian now is going to correct me. That's fine. But it is. But I do think it's really important that we recognize that one of the reasons we had such a, but also that at the time of our founding, there were many people who were not religious. It wasn't that everyone was going to church. There were people who didn't go to church. So it's really important that we acknowledge, our background, but not as a way to slam religion, but as a way to actually open up religion. And say it really was intended to be a place where people of all faith backgrounds could thrive. And George Washington, no one is tolerated here. Everyone is here because by the fact of their birth, that they should be able to freely exercise their religion, no matter what. So this is very important for us to say. Yeah.
I'm just so honored to be here. Thank you. I could listen to you all afternoon. I know other people have time constraints maybe, but
I'm sorry. You're saying a nice thing about me and I want you to say it louder so everyone can hear.
I'm just so appreciative of you being and coming to Cedar Rapids. Thank you. It's just my honor to be here and to be amongst you and all these these wonderful people here. We need to also recognize and cheer on. There are a lot of youth who are not putting up with this nonsense, this Christian nationalism, this Seven Mountains Dominionism, what have you. This is the Texas stuff, moved up into Colorado now, wanting to be in Iowa. But we just really have to support and applaud our youth to keep going, stick with it, with it. So I really wanted to lift up our youth who are, they're not buying this.
No,
they're not buying it. What's going on in their schools. They're actually pretty angry. So, and they're being vocal. We need their vocalism and we need to cheer them on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I haven't told you about, I have a podcast now. I do have a podcast, and I end every conversation I have is what gives you hope, and because I want people to have hope, and young people say young people all the time, and I feel the same way. Like oh, young people, it's not that way at all. They're very energized, but many of them are not involved in a religious tradition. And we have to acknowledge that. And we have to acknowledge that many of the people who left the church, I'll say, left because of perceived anti-LGBTQ attacks. They thought, I don't want to be a part of that. My friends are that way. I'm just not going to be a part of an institution that does that. So as the evangelist part of me is like, what a bad tactic. But anyway, I'm not here to make more Christians. I'm just saying that seems like a bad tactic for the church. But I want to say this crew is a wonderful crew. We don't have to bemoan the fact that there aren't young people here, but how do we reach out to them and listen, be curious, create common cause, offer them support, offer them space, offer them encouragement, because they live and breathe a wonderful vision of inclusivity, many of them. And I just encourage us, I really take the point, and not to like say, oh, I wish, this is a bad meeting because it's not filled with young people on a Friday lunch, but more because, more because I think it's an opportunity for common cause and solidarity.
Yeah. And just lastly, and this ties in with the youth too, but certainly all of us is, well, of course, they're into the anti-gun, trying to save themselves,
right?
Because some adults won't. But it's like they are organized with voting. Show up and vote.
Yeah.
This is their message. This needs to be our message.
Yeah.
So, okay. Did I keep it brief enough?
Just a comment and then a question. Andrew Whitehead is an expert on Christian nationalism. Will be speaking at First Presbyterian Church on Monday, November 6th at 7:30. So note that date.
And if you want to hear a preview of Andrew Whitehead, he was on my podcast. I know it's growing old, but it's true.
Andrew Whitehead. It's 7:30 p.m. and November 6th. At First Presbyterian. Question is, what would your great-grandfather, Walter Raushenbush, say about Christian nationalism?
It's an interesting question because my great-grandfather wrote a book called Christianizing the Social Order. And if we were to hear that today, we'd be like, what does he want to do? The way, and he had, he did believe as a pastor, what he meant by that was a radical realignment of the power structures that would make sure that everyone was equally treated and had equal access to capital and the ability to thrive. That said, he would have. There's a great quote, and I wish I had it with me. A great quote by my great-grandfather, who was like, he recognized that religion could do great, wonderful things and terrible things. And his deepest hope and concern was that his faith, he was a seventh in a line of pastors, his faith would be exercised into creating a society where those who had been viewed as disposable and marginalized were valued and had a sense of true inclusion and equality in the culture. That was his goal, and that was the way he understood. He said, that's the role that the prophets told us to do and Jesus told us to do, and that's what the church should be about. And if you're not doing that today, you're not the Church of Jesus Christ. You're a different kind of church. And so my sense is that the authoritarianism, the militarism, the sense of cruelty that we see would be absolutely absolutely repellent. I think he was very good friends with Stephen Wise and spoke at synagogues as well as historically black colleges. However, he had a sense of Christianity be the lingua franca of the country, which it primarily was. So he might be a little bit surprised that we're talking about religious diversity as much as we are. But I think the overall effort of equal justice under the law, he would absolutely believe. And so I try not to be too Pollyanna about Walter Raushenbush or Louis Brandeis, because they certainly were not perfect human beings. But I think at their heart and their goal and their intentions were very aligned with a democracy that works for everybody. And I think that's what we're fighting for today.
Yeah, I have a question. And first of all, it's on the singularity, I guess, of Christianity and why this is Christian nationalists. And I think about where we are today and the ecumenical nature of the people, in this building, the ecumenical nature of the audience in this building, the idea that we have the first mosque west of the Mississippi River in this community. And yet we talk about Christian nationalists. We say Christian, that includes me, and I assume it includes quite a group of the people in this room. And yet we get also then carry the nationalist when you mention that. And somehow I think we have to differentiate between what you have already said, and 70% of the people, and probably more than that in this room, would not disagree with what you have to say. And yet, as we leave here, I feel like I'm carrying that burden with me.
Yeah.
So how do you?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I want it's an imperfect term to talk about a political movement that is never meant to be that we're not talking about a religion. We're not talking about Christians. We're talking about political movement that does carry with it the mantle of Christianity. In January 6th, you saw all the Jesus flags and all the crosses. But I think it's very important. There's a lot of, I've talked to so many people about this very question. People wrestle with this. Good people are like, you're lumping. In fact, some of my Jewish friends are like, I don't want to lump in all the Christians with Christian nationalism. And I appreciate that. I do feel like, one of the organizations we work with closely is called BJC, Baptist Joint Committee, and they have started something called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And they recognize that in some ways, we can't completely divorce ourselves from the fact that this is coming out of our tradition, but also recognize that it is in other parts of the world. So Christian nationalism in this country is very similar to religious movements in India, in the Middle East, in Russia, in Hungary. So it is not inherently a Christian thing, but it is the recognition that a nationalist movement can use a religion to give itself a religious potency and religious mantle to try to attain its aims. And so that is, I would encourage you to recognize that what we're describing here is a political movement, not a religious movement, to not try too hard to divorce oneself from the fact that that Christians are, or people who are claiming Christianity are doing this, but perhaps use that as a motivation for why Christians who don't agree with this political movement can step up and say, not in the name of my religion. And so that's the reason I'm very quick to say I am a pastor, I'm a religious person, and I am a patriot. And I reject Christian nationalism because it's bad for my faith, it's bad for my country, and it's bad for my family. And so that I think is something that all of us have to wrestle with. But it's a question that is being called, and it may be that in 5 or 10 years we come up with a better term to art. But this is the term to art right now to describe something. And so I would encourage you to consider how you're going to respond to that configuration.
Help me to thank Reverend Paul Raushenbush, please. I just want to point out his stand is nearly as tall as I am, so. I am grateful for you. I'm grateful for you coming to Iowa and accepting the invitation from Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, best affiliate in the country. We are grateful to work alongside, always work alongside our national organization. And we do a lot of the things, when you ask the question about what can I do, we do a lot of the things that Paul lifted up to you. So if there are a lot of new people in the room, if you are not part of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, if you're not on our email list, if you're not part of our network, please do join us. We hope that you will. You can do that on our website, or you can go back and revisit Bridget over here, and we have these handy dandy little forms, and we will put you onto the network. You can engage. We not only do this forum in Cedar Rapids, we have a similar forum in Des Moines as well, but we do a lot of education work. We do a tremendous amount of advocacy work. We spend our days at the State House during the legislative session. But we do all of that work to make sure that you have the tools and to empower you to use your voices. That is the purpose, building those relationships and empowering Iowans across the state, because we are statewide, we are nonpartisan, but we care deeply about all of these issues. So we hope that you will join us in this work. And I'm just grateful for you and your presence. Intersections is a monthly luncheon, so I hope that you will also join us next month, the first Friday of every month. And I forgot to look at you have the schedule. Who is it? Okay. Oh, it's Amy Walkendorf. Yeah. Who is a council person, first transgender council person in Iowa. And so come back and hear from her. Do make a reservation if you can, and then we'll have chairs available for you. And you can order your lunch as well if you choose. You can bring your lunch with you. But we're really glad to have you in the room, and we're really glad to do this work with you. Thank you again, Paul. We are so glad to have you in Iowa. Have a great weekend. Take care.